Welcome to episode 8 in the first season of Justice Center Weekly, a 30-minute video cast from the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. I'm your host, Kevin Steele, and today I have with me the president and founder of the center, John Carpay. John was on the road this past weekend, speaking at a couple of events. We're going to ask him for some highlights from his travels, first to the Alberta Home Education Association Conference in Red Deer, and then over to Vancouver Island, where he spoke at the Reclaiming Canada Conference in Victoria. Welcome, John, and I hope you have recovered from that 1-hour BC to Alberta jet lag. That Pacific to Mountain time shift can be rough, and that's not taking into account the oxygen deprivation from the change in altitude. John?
Change in altitude, and we still have forest fires in Alberta, although there's less smoke in Calgary today than what there was last week. So that's a good development. So the conference in Red Deer was fantastic. Alberta Home Education Association has an annual conference usually in May. Of course, it was shut down, closed, and not happening for 2 or 3 years, but they are back in action. And it was a real honor to speak there about reclaiming rights and freedoms. And I always remind people of the maxim attributed to Edmund Burke: the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. Because during the question and answer session, and this always happens at public meetings, people are in a state of despair. There's still so much work that needs to be done on the rights and freedoms front. For example, in Alberta today, it is still required to wear a face mask when you're in a hospital, even though that's not backed by science. And we're long past all of the fear mongering from 3 years ago. You have requirements like this are still in the books. In British Columbia, there are doctors and nurses who, despite an acute shortage of healthcare workers in the British Columbia healthcare system, you have doctors and nurses that are not allowed to come back to work based on a legitimate decision that they made a year and a half ago to not get injected with a substance for which there's no long-term safety data. So when people get discouraged, I say, look, we just got to keep on fighting. We're going to win in the end, because truth always wins out over lies, and fear wins out over facts. Facts win out over fear, and freedom ultimately wins out over tyranny.
Good. Okay. And how was the weather in Victoria? I was going to ask you about that, because, of course, we've had, as you say, the forest fires here, which has made it rather unpleasant. I'm sure you were enjoying the clear air, clear ocean air, as well as the conference there.
It was a very good conference. It was called Reclaiming Canada. It was organized by We Unify Canada, and the speakers included the Honorable Brian Peckford, Will Dove from Strong and Free Canada. There were speakers on the Friday, Saturday, and Sunday for 3 days in a row. On Sunday, we had some fantastic doctors there. We had Dr. Pelek from the University of British Columbia, who's been witness and expert witness in some of the Justice Center's court actions. We had Dr. Stephen Malthouse, who has been at the forefront of challenging the so-called science behind the lockdown measures. He's been at the forefront for a long time. We heard from Dr. Makis, who has a lot to say about the he covered quite a few topics. One of them, the unusually high rate of deaths amongst younger doctors, so doctors in their 50s, 40s, 30s, and how there's so many more younger doctors are dying in Canada as opposed to other years. And of course, he suggests that has something to do with the vaccine, since the medical doctors have a very high vaccination rate with the new COVID vaccine.
Okay, we want to move on to a new topic now right away. That is a press release that's on the Justice Center website right now, and that was concerning a teenager in Ottawa who had a ticket from 2020 during the lockdowns when he was shooting basketball hoops. Rather interesting development. John, do you want to tell us a little bit about it?
So William Vogelsang was 17 years old in April of 2020. So 3 years and a month have gone by. He was playing basketball by himself in a park in Ottawa. He was confronted by two bylaw officers. He said he had no idea that he couldn't be there by himself, which of course is kind of a logical, what is this? People must not forget how utterly unscientific these lockdown measures were. And we cannot forget about this, because if we forget, then they're going to be repeated and we'll be subjected to grave injustices once again with the stripping away of our charter rights and freedoms, based on an appeal to science, but with measures that are utterly unscientific. I mean, obviously, there's zero risk of COVID spreading by way of a 17-year-old or a person of any age playing basketball in a public park
By
and
himself.
by himself. I would take it a step further. When you're outdoors, there the risk of the spread of COVID is minimal. Plus, amongst young people are threatened by COVID the way that young people are threatened by lightning strikes, meaning that yes, you might get one or two children dying per year from lightning strikes, the same way you get one or two children dying per year from COVID. Those individual deaths are horrific and tragic. And at the same time, when you're basing public policy on those kinds of odds, it's wrong to oppress an entire population just because there's one or two people that might be getting killed by COVID or lightning strikes. That's not what you base public policy on. So the bylaw officers apparently told William Vogelsang that they had to give him a ticket, which was a bald-faced lie. In fact, on the same CBC website that I think, Kevin, you'll post a link to it, there's a video there from the head of bylaw enforcement of Ottawa who says it is in the discretion of the officer whether to issue a ticket or not. So these officers could have issued a warning to William Vogelsang and said, it's illegal for you to be here by yourself playing basketball. He offered to go home and they said, no, we're going to give you a ticket for $880. Hugely stressful to a young man that never had any kind of problems or trouble with the law of any kind. He's suddenly given an $880 ticket. Horrifically stressful. Does not want his parents to have to pay it. Can't pay it himself. Turned to the Justice Centre. And so the Justice Centre has negotiated with the Crown, and the Crown has agreed to withdraw the charges.
Yes, I noticed. Yeah, it was lawyer Chris Fleury that did that. We had him on this show a few episodes previous talking about his client Harold Jonker. So, and he did mention that he had other clients that were facing tickets, and I guess this is one that he was referring to. It's rather interesting how the negotiations that he went through, because it looks like the bylaw officers didn't keep notes, or at least one of them didn't, and that was one of the reasons that they dropped the ticket. So, yeah.
Shame on the bylaw officers. This is this is the dark side of human nature that we have to be aware of its existence. And I think human nature is a mixture of good and evil. We see people all the time doing really good things. We also see people doing bad things. One of the reasons why we have rights and freedoms is because when the state can trample on our mobility rights or freedom of association, the type of stuff done to this 17-year-old William Vogelsang, you see the dark side of human nature that some people like to oppress. They like to lord it over their neighbors. We saw this as well with all the snitch lines that were set up. 38 million Canadians were under surveillance for a very long time. And so we have to remember these injustices to reduce the risk of repeating them.
Well, speaking of the Justice Center website, I know that we are producing some great videos now, and these are Brave Canadian videos produced by our communications department. And I know that you wanted to comment on them because it's so good to see the clients and hear them in their own words.
So Carolyn Burjowski is a courageous teacher, recently retired, in Waterloo, Ontario. And in January of 2022, she spoke at a public meeting of the Waterloo Public School Board, and she followed the procedure. She was registered. She was slated to speak. She had her 10 minutes. and she expressed concerns about a school board policy of culling harmful books. And so this included things like Dr. Seuss and this kind of a diversity, equity, inclusion, political correctness type of culling of anything that, well, the criteria were not clear. What are the criteria being used to get rid of books? So Carolyn Berjowski was concerned about the absence of clearly defined criteria. What's this whole culling process about? And then she added in that she was concerned about books in the school library that promoted transgender ideology to children, that made it sound like taking puberty blockers and then doing opposite sex hormones and getting gender reassignment surgery was kind of simple, quick, easy, no problems, kind of cool, and that it promoted that viewpoint to children without really giving a balanced approach that would, for example, include reference to permanent, lifelong infertility, which, you could argue if you're 13, 14, 15 years old, maybe you're too young to be making that as a permanent, lifelong decision. Maybe when you're 25 or 35 or 45, maybe you do want to become a parent. And her microphone was cut off by the school board chair. So the school board chair cut off Carolyn's microphone and kicked her out of the meeting, which was a nonviolent process because it was a Zoom meeting in January of 2022. So it was easy to kick her out of the meeting without needing to have the security guards manhandle her and drag her out, anything like that. But just absolutely horrific. The rationale provided by the school board was that Carolyn Berjowski's comments were somehow in violation of the Ontario Human Rights Code, which is ridiculous because the Ontario Human Rights Code does not regulate speech. It does not say anything in there about what you can and cannot say. So the whole premise of the school board saying, well, we're going to monitor speech here to make sure that it all conforms and complies to the Ontario Human Rights Code is a bald-faced lie. It's just completely false. And shame on the school board for using that kind of tactics, trying to dress up their censorship and their bullying as if it's appropriate concern for following the law. Just very disgusting. So Carolyn is suing the school board, and the court hearing takes place on Monday, June 5th. And so this is a really important court action. I want to thank the Justice Centre donors who have contributed to this. And please consider donating again if you have not done so recently. 100% of our funding comes from voluntary donations from Canadians. And we're a registered charity. You'll get an official tax receipt. So please donate today to support courageous Canadians like Carolyn Berjowski.
Yes, indeed. And I just want to point out one thing I really loved about this video is because we're hearing from the clients and we're hearing them tell their own stories. So we're not necessarily hearing them from a lawyerly perspective. So what they think is important to tell is sometimes different from, the facts scenario that a lawyer might see. And in this video, one thing I loved was she told us the effect that the school board had on her case. And it was an example of the Streisand effect. She talks about this, that they had sent out an email blast to a lot of people regarding the things that she had said. And that's kind of what pushed the whole story forward. It was the fact, and then she started hearing from people that were, looking at the issue and realizing they actually supported her. So it was the actions of the school board in sending out all this information to people trying to paint her as a bad person that actually garnered her a lot of sympathy. So I thought that was a brilliant insight that I hadn't heard anywhere else. So, kudos to our communications department for getting those together and giving us that perspective. I think it's an important thing that our audience and our donors would like to see.
Carolyn Berjowski video is worth seeing. Other videos as well. And she talks about how she got nasty email from her employer. She was still a teacher at the time that she spoke at this public meeting. And she'd been an elementary school teacher teaching English as a second language for over 20 years. And she was told not to report for work. And the school board chair publicly denounced her as mean and cruel and unkind and causing harm to transgender individuals, et cetera, et cetera. There was all of this public name calling. And then Carolyn Berjowski says in the video, people wanted to get in touch. Everybody was curious. Well, what did she say? Because she's being painted as some sort of a monster. So what did this monster say? And then people, and it's on Rumble. When you see her remarks, they're very reasonable, mild-mannered suggestions presented in a very gentle manner.
Yeah.
So lots of publicity for that. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. There's another one that I wanted to mention. That was the Joanne Walsh case. Maybe you just want to quickly give us a recap on that one.
So Joanne Walsh is a senior citizen, a retired Canadian, and she was subjected to persecution and harassment upon returning to Canada. This was during the dark days of the federal government requiring everyone to use the ArriveCan app. And by the way, the Justice Centre was the first organization in Canada to take the federal government to court over mandatory use of ArriveCan. And a few weeks later, the federal government ditched its policy and said it was no longer mandatory. But we're still defending people like Joanne Walsh, who people receiving these massive fines for not using a particular program, not a very good program, and one for which the government paid far too much money, but just utterly irrational when you could have enforced these, COVID tests and vaccinations and a negative COVID test, et cetera, et cetera. You could have enforced those measures by still allowing people, particularly elderly people, to produce their hard copy paper evidence. And for the government to force everyone to use an app was a bad thing. So the Joanne Walsh video is just really worth seeing and listening to.
Oh, for sure. And again, this is another reminder of what we all went through. And I just want to point out, because I remember when we were talking on the other podcast about how everything seemed to be taking a long time. And that was what I considered, well, kind of a problem with the court system. And at this point, it's turned around, because now it's an advantage, because of the delays, we're on the other side of the COVID panic. And now we have these reminders coming out of the court system of what we all went through. So, all of a sudden, what I viewed as a disadvantage has turned around.
It's you mentioned the long run, and this is important as well for people to remember perseverance. We are in a war to defend the free society, to defend our rights and freedoms. It's not a war that's being fought with bombs and bullets and tanks and guns and so on, but it is a war for the soul of Canada as a free society. And we see some very dark forces on the federal level. We keep on hearing about the federal government still planning to protect us from online disinformation, online misinformation, and to protect us from hate speech. And hate speech is going to be defined in practice as speech that Justin Trudeau hates. And that's going to be hate speech, and it'll be banned. And so we are in very dark times, and we have to remember to keep on fighting, to keep on keeping on. We need the virtue of courage to speak truth to power, and we need the virtue of perseverance, because in a war, you do lose some battles, and sometimes you take 5 steps forward, 2 steps backwards, 3 steps forward, 7 steps backwards, but there's a back and forth, but eventually you're moving in the right direction. I asked people to imagine Christmas 1945. And so early in the year, Nazi Germany was defeated along with fascist Italy. Later in the year, August, September, Imperial Japan was defeated. And so Christmas 1945 is the first Christmas in at least 6 years or longer in parts of the world. First Christmas in 6 or more years where there's peace and there's victory for the side that fought against Nazi Germany. But compare that to Christmas 1940. Christmas 1940, Hitler and the Nazis control all of mainland Europe. Every country in Europe is either occupied by the Nazis or allied with the Nazis. Best case scenario, you've got Spain and Portugal that are neutral, but they're not really working against Hitler. So he controls all of the forests and mines and minerals and factories and agriculture, everything. All of Europe is controlled by Hitler and the Nazis. And you've got America is neutral. We're talking Christmas 1940. America is not lending help, or at least not much, to Britain. Britain stands alone, and it has not been preparing for war in the previous 7 years the way that Germany has. So Britain is actually very weak. Like, what a rotten Christmas. But it's perseverance that took us from Christmas of 1940, when things were looking very bleak, very dark. There's no certainty whatsoever in Christmas 1940 that our side was going to win. And yet people persevered. They made sacrifices. They worked hard. They did the best they could. And so 5 years later, you get to Christmas 1945, and these anti-freedom enemies have been defeated by our democracies that cherish our fundamental freedoms of conscience and religion and speech and association and peaceful assembly and all of those rights and freedoms. So we're in a war today. It's a different kind of war. It's not against a foreign power. Canada is not about to be invaded by anybody, no foreigners, but it's a war here against some of our citizens who hate the free society and who want to destroy it. And so we have to, with peaceful means, we have to fight tooth and nail and persevere so that we can win this war for our freedoms.
Oh, yeah. And I think that the video series is appropriately titled, Brave Canadians, because it's good to see these people and to hear what they've gone through, and knowing that they are persevering. I'm reminded of the saying that courage can be contagious. And I think that's one of the benefits that we will probably see down the road as other people see what these people have gone through and say, well, when it comes to my turn, maybe I'll be able to stand up as well. So I look forward to more of those for sure. Okay. Thanks so much, John, for spending a half hour with us for Justice Center Weekly. I hope to speak to you again really soon here or on our other podcast, which comes out every week as well. That's Justice with John. That's audio only. Thanks so much for being with us, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you, Kevin, and my thanks to all the Justice Center supporters for your faithful and generous support. We're going to keep on fighting very hard to win these battles for freedom.